you can see exactly when things started changing. And it was in 1984 and 1986 when the oil companies began giving their contributions to Republicans, and not just Republicans, but people who supported that industry view where we got to stay competitive, we being the oil companies. We have to have tax stability. The state has been constantly trying to give the companies the incentive to invest. So the tax systems become more about incentives than about revenue producing. They were getting people elected that supported that as a policy for the state. And I think an important thing for people to realize is part of the reason that was so successful is because the Senate is just 20 people. Alaska's a cheap date. You don't have to have that many people in the important positions as long as they are in the top.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guest is Lisa Weissler, author of the book Capital Crude, The Impact of Oil on Alaska Politics. The book was the recipient of a 2025 Alaska Historical Society Award for its promotion and understanding of Alaska history. Lisa began working in the Alaska State Capitol in 1981, where she staffed for Representative Sam Cotton of Juneau. She later worked for Representatives Fred Zaroff of Kodiak, Ethan Berkowitz of Anchorage, and Beth Kurtula of Juneau, and Senator Hollis French of Anchorage. Interspersed between legislative staffing gigs, she worked for the Department of Natural Resources, went to law school at the University of Oregon, clerked for Judge Bud Carpenetti, worked for Alaska's Coastal Program in Governor Knowles' administration, and worked for the Department of Law and the Oil and Gas Division in Governor Palin's administration. Finally, in Governor Walker's administration, she was tasked with writing a paper on the history of Alaska's oil and gas tax credit system. That paper grew into the book we are talking about today. Lisa Weissler, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
To get started, just tell us a little bit about your early life.
Well, my dad was career Air Force. He was a pilot, and so we moved a lot. And so that was my growing up, was moving. And let's see, we ended up in Germany for my last year of high school. And I ended up going from there to Southern Illinois University in Carbondale to study forestry because I had this idea that we could save the trees if only we knew how. And 1970s was not really the time for that, but I did get my forestry degree. I graduated in 78. Worked for the Forest Service then for the next 3 years in Idaho and Colorado, and then just had this idea that I was going to go to Alaska and applied for a summer job, got it in Juneau, took the ferry from Prince Rupert to Juneau, and that's when it landed downtown. And for the first time in my life, I knew I was home. And that was, April 13th, 1980, I landed in Juneau. Worked for the Forest Service for the summer, for the lab, and I was really never that good at forestry. I was not really into science, but I really wanted to stay in Juneau. They kept me on as long as they could for a summer job till February. March of 81, I had a roommate, Nancy Lord. I don't know if you ever read any of her books. She's from Homer. She's written some really amazing Alaska stories. And she was working for the legislature, and I'd go to parties with her, met Sam Cotton, who was the finance chair in 1981, just making conversation, said I needed a job, and he offered me a trial, and that launched my legislative career. And that I did from 81 until, she did a little list here, till 88. And then I got a job at the Department of Natural Resources.
Were you with Sam Cotton for that whole first 7-year period?
No, he actually lost his election in 1982. So I worked for Fred Zaroff for 2 years. He was from Kodiak. Later became a senator. He's passed on since then. But Sam came back in session of 85. So I worked for Sam again.
So I want to bounce back to 1981 when you started working for Sam Cotton, because you started working right before the coup in the House.
I did.
And I have tried to do podcasts about the coup, and it's never really worked out. In June 1981, the Alaska legislature was rocked by a political coup when a group of Democratic House members broke away from the Democratic-led majority coalition headed by Speaker Jim Duncan and reorganized the House under new leadership in a Republican-dominated majority. The revolt was driven by disputes over the handling of Alaska's rapidly growing oil wealth. At the time of the coup, Democrats made up the majorities in both the Alaska House and Senate. After the coup, Democrats would not dominate the majority in both legislative bodies again until 2025. I would love to hear from you, your perspective as a brand new staffer. First of all, how soon after you started working did the coup happen?
I started working in March. The coup was in June.
So you'd been there for a couple of months.
A couple of months, yeah.
And I guess, like, for listeners who don't know, what were the issues involved with the coup and how was your office involved?
Well, Sam was finance chair. And so...
And it was a majority Democrat leadership in the House.
Yes, it was. Jim Duncan from Juneau was the speaker. Yeah, it was Democrat majority. And remember, I was a new staffer. I was a small fry. I was not in the room where things happened. So my experience was all on the fringes of things where we heard something was going on downstairs and all scurried down to the second floor and hanging out. I guess we all went down there after the House was taken over, before the Democrats caucus had gone in there. And,
so I guess to explain for listeners, so the Democrats were having a caucus and 3 of the Democrats were not there because they were in the chambers with Republicans.
No, much of what I know, I actually learned from working on the book and talking to a few people. But it was that, the Democrats were caucusing because they'd heard that this might happen. I guess Russ Meekins, a Democrat, informed Jim Duncan that this was going to happen. So they were caucusing just down the hall from the House chambers in the Speaker's office. And meanwhile, the floor was supposed to go into session at 10 a.m. and it didn't. But that's when the Republicans went in.
So the speaker delayed House to the call of the chair or something.
Yeah. And anyhow, so they went in and they started proceedings. And what I have in my memory, standing in the hallway there, people should understand, and anyone up in the Capitol, this is all very small spaces. This is not spacious or anything. You're plastered against the wall and people are walking by. And I remember it was like a triangle with Jim Duncan at the front and Democrats behind him, with Jim with his jaw clenched and then storming into the chambers. And then for us on the outside, it was just, we could hear the yelling. And really,
because you guys couldn't get into the galleries to watch.
They locked the galleries. They had locked the galleries. And I think someone had said lock the doors to the chambers before the Democrats got in, but that didn't happen. I have heard, too, that when the Democrats came through, that hit a page. They hit the pages in the front of the door. But, in terms of what happened, why it happened, and this did take research, because it really, there is a video. I don't know if you've ever seen it.
Oh, yeah, I've seen it. It's on YouTube.
Yeah, it's fabulous.
In fact, I'll play a little bit of it right now.
Okay.
I think we'll have the part, was her name Sally, who was a legislator who just kept saying, no.
Sally Smith.
Yeah.
She was very feisty.
The question before the body is, shall Jim Duncan be removed from Speaker of the House? I'm voting in Representative Duncan's place.
I call the House.
Motion is out of order. All members have been excused from the call of the House.
On what vote? When was this body called to order? Mr. Speaker pro tem, I assume.
You are out of order.
When was
We are in the
this
middle of a
called to
roll
order?
call.
That was a quorum call. We haven't started the roll call. When was this House called into this room? There was no buzzer and there was no bell.
The clerk will take the call.
I
take the
protest
roll.
this vote.
Point of order.
You can protest the vote. We are in the middle of a roll call.
Point of order.
Representative Brown.
Point of order. If a member is speaking during the roll call, you must stop the roll call. In addition to that, this is an illegally constituted proceeding. The speaker has not designated you to sit in his place. Also, on a point of parliamentary inquiry, I'd like to know how many votes you believe are necessary with regard to this matter.
Your point of order is not well taken. I'm legally conducting a roll call vote. It takes 21 votes to remove the speaker. The clerk will take the roll.
I call for, I've got to think of what this call is. I'm contesting the ruling of the chair. This is just not appropriate proceeding.
Mr. Speaker.
The clerk will take the roll.
Mr. Speaker.
Is the roll open on the question?
Mr. Speaker.
But it was Fred Brown from Fairbanks who really sticks in my mind because he was a lawyer and he would just stand there, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, in this baritone voice. And he did that through the whole thing, Mr. Speaker. And,
I guess the Democrats, one of whom was Russ Meekins, who was sitting in the speaker's chair.
yes.
What was the motivation for those Democrats to give the power to the Republicans?
Well, it was really about money. And the Democrats wanted to save money. The Republicans wanted to spend it on infrastructure. And the rural communities that the legislators represented, other than Russ Meekins, who was from Anchorage, they were worried for them. They would get the short end of the stick. And so they went along with the Republicans who were going to spend more money. And in the end, it just got divvied up evenly.
You tell the story of, because your boss was a finance co-chair, so he had a
He was
large...
the chair.
He
That
was
the
the
time
chair. That
before
was back in the
had
time when they had
co-chairs.
the chair. So he was the chair, and you guys came to your office and the doors were locked.
It was a couple of days later. Yeah, I came in and the doors were locked and all of our stuff was moved down the hall to a small office.
And I'm assuming that as the chair of the finance committee, that he had more staff. And so by losing the chairmanship, did he have to let anybody go?
Everybody left except for me and a guy named Charlie Willis.
Wow.
And I don't know, I don't remember any conversation about anything. It was just suddenly everybody was gone.
Wow. And again, you're still a relatively new staffer. So
Oh, yeah. My thing was I had a job and I'm so glad to have a job and I liked it. I was just coming in and doing my job. And, I did mostly constituent work then and that needed to get done. So, yeah, I was just there doing my work.
So Russ Meekins was also involved in a scandal with Senator George Homan of Bethel,
Correct.
where there were bribes offered. And I just can't remember the specifics of what, but it was a lot of money.
Yeah, it was for firefighting planes from Canada or something. And George Holman wanted an appropriation for them and offered Russ Meekins something in exchange for that. I mean,
Because Russ Meekins was then the chair of finance.
He wasn't the chair. Al Adams was chair. I don't know, but he had some power there. So, yeah, that happened. And, Russ was not actually implicated in it. But
Didn't he wear a wire?
I don't know.
I think so. So the reason why I'm asking these questions, it's like I said, I've tried to do a podcast about the coup, and Russ Meekins has passed away, but his sister, Susan Sullivan, who was also a legislator, she has passed away in the last year.
Oh.
But a couple of years ago, she initially agreed to come on the podcast to talk about the coup.
Okay.
And we went so far as to schedule an in-person interview in which I went to her home, and she decided not to do it because she said that George Holman went to prison, I think, for a period of time because of this. And he later came back and was on Bethel City Council. So he got back into elected office. The bottom line is that Susan said that her brother was terrified, that there were threats on him and his family, and that's why they left. That he left, that they left the state and never came back because he was terrified. And she was afraid to talk about it even today.
Right. And I think there was far more of that than I would be aware of. I mean, in fact, I didn't know that bit. And something that to know about my book is I am not a journalist. I am a lawyer. I'm good at research and not great at asking questions or interviewing people. But I also realized, like maybe you have, is that, yeah, people have very different memories of things. So everything in my book is tied to newspaper articles, committee minutes, anything that was written down. And the only side things are things that I personally witnessed that I knew really happened.
Well, and I want to talk about that because, when you're in the legislature and you're reading the newspaper coverage, I think every legislator, when they read it, they think, oh, they got this part right. Oh, this part's kind of right.
Yes.
Oh, they're really missing the entire context for this.
Yes, I thought about that.
And okay, so full disclosure, this is another disclaimer. My chief of staff is Kyle Johansson, and he does appear in your book in the section on coastal management.
Yes, he does.
So, needless to say, he has opinions. I actually screenshotted his name and the context and sent it to him. And he's like, oh, I don't regret that vote at all. I have no problems with that vote. He's like, that one paragraph is not capturing everything that happened. And then he said some things about this is newspaper reporting.
I can tell you, I certainly thought about that because I have had newspaper articles where I'm quoted. And it's like, wait, what? I decided, though, again, this was all things that were in print, and that it's a story and that this would capture overall what happened. And everyone would have their own reasons for things, and somebody else would have a different explanation. So if I let myself get caught up in that, I never would have been able to at least bring together what I did.
It's very important. What you did is very, very important to someone like me, because I think talking about the gas line, for example, and going all the way back to 1954, when there was the first proposal for a potential gas line, I think getting that history, even if it is based on newspaper reporting from 1954 until today, it's giving me a timeline and a context for understanding where we are today that I don't have. And so I am very grateful for it, and I find it extremely meaningful. And when I think about it, as somebody who just went through this last session and the special sessions, and we're in a special session technically right now about the gas line, I think it would be very, very difficult for me as somebody who was in the room today in 2026 to tell you exactly which bills happened in which order, how they were shifted, and why each bill failed. It's very hard to do.
Yeah. No, I know. Yes. And I think that, again, that is why I did it the way I did. And the other part of it was following the legislative thread. I mean, clearly that's what I know the best and what I could offer that not everybody could do in terms of finding the history. And yeah, it was to hit those points.
I get into a whole philosophical thing about like, what is history and what does it mean and who records the history and why. And hey, shout out to all the journalists who are doing the contemporaneous reporting, because that will be the history.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that it gets to another point too. It's whose perspective. Now, the book is my perspective, and I do not deny I have a perspective, but I wanted it to be as factual as possible. Again, not being in the room. I think the Kyle Johansson story is an excellent example, because I would not have expected him to regret his vote. He believed what he did. It was not even, it's negative if you wanted the COSTA program. It's not negative if you didn't want it.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't want it, so it's not reflecting on him in a negative way. That was his story.
Well, and I guess maybe this gets into a little bit of a philosophical discussion of what it means to be a staffer and what a staffer thinks and does. It is unusual that I have a former legislator in my office. It's unusual that that legislator was a Republican who was the majority leader in the House working in a Democrat's office. I'll just say, from my perspective as the legislator and him as my staff, he absolutely promotes my legislative agenda in every way, shape, or form. And he delivers.
That's awesome. Yeah. And you're the majority.
Well, I am. I'm in the majority. From your perspective, having staffed multiple folks over the years, having worked in multiple administrations, including the Palin administration, I mean, do you recall any times where you felt like you had to represent your boss and you weren't personally invested in the outcome, I guess?
That happens. It never happened that I was against or opposed to anything that they were doing. Not really. I mean, I have stopped ideas that were pretty outlandish, but that was before they got into legislation.
Do you remember any?
Not off the top of my head, and I don't think even if I did to talk about it. But it can happen. And that's a staff person's job too, is to keep their boss looking good. And no, it's the job. And I've always worked for people who I really respected and wanted to see succeed. So to me, yeah, you do what the job calls for. And in my perspective was that if I couldn't, I didn't. I did not work for that person. I knew I could not support Governor Murkowski's agenda. And so I left. And I left the COSTA program at noon of the day he got sworn in because I knew what was coming. Working for the Palin administration, people forget that her first year, she did some very positive things. I mean, I was working for Representative Crude Palin's first year and working on the gas line legislation and thought it was great. Going to work for the Department of Law, I actually heard that it was a point of discussion about having me there, but I had a good enough reputation that I got the job.
And Palin had Democrats in her administration. She had Pat Galvin, who was a registered Democrat, as Commissioner of Revenue. And
he was the director of the COSTA program when I worked there.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And then Marty Rutherford also worked, and she was at DNR. She was deputy commissioner. Anyhow, go back.
So I want to bounce back to the 80s because I have had folks on the podcast who have discussed the Sheffield impeachment, including Joe Josephson, who was in some ways the de facto defense attorney in the Senate, so to speak. I mean, he was a senator, but he was defending Sheffield. And so talking about the $9 million contract for a building in Fairbanks. And I have to say, hearing it from my perspective in the 2020s of being like, oh, that just seems like so not corruption by today's standard. Like it seems so mild. However, your book gave me really good insight because in this whole section on corruption, I'm going to just read a couple sentences. You said, Sheffield shocked the political world when in his first month as governor, he flew on an oil company corporate jet to attend a series of oil company-sponsored fundraisers in Houston, Dallas, and Denver. Sheffield raised $150,000 at the fundraisers that he used to pay off part of a $350,000 campaign loan he'd made to himself. He literally, in his first month as governor, flew around the country raising money from oil companies to pay himself.
He did. I was surprised too. I found that through my research. I didn't know that then.
Oh, really?
Really?
So, yeah, because you were there. You were in the building around the time.
I was in the building. But again, staff, You don't
Right.
actually get too involved. I mean, the thing I remember from that time was that the Senate really didn't know what to do about it. And that's kind of how they ended up where they did. That's really my strongest memory.
And what was interesting, and I'm so grateful because I kind of had heard this, but I hadn't seen it in print. The grand jury did not indict the governor on any charges. So he wasn't going to be criminally charged for anything. But the grand jury did recommend that he be impeached, which I think is so interesting because I didn't know grand juries could do that.
Again, this is all things I learned that I had no idea of at the time. Yeah, it is pretty shocking.
What it gave me was some context for understanding the Sheffield impeachment. Because in the context of a governor who spent his first month flying around the country raising money to pay himself back hundreds of thousands of dollars, that changes the way you look at his actions in the next few months in terms of awarding contracts to friends.
Right.
I feel like we've skirted around the margins of what your book is truly about. Your book is truly about oil and Alaska politics. I would love,
Yeah.
and we haven't really talked about oil yet, but I would love for you to read the first 3 paragraphs of chapter 10.
All three paragraphs?
All 3.
In 2024, Alaska is still an oil state. In some ways, Alaska's situation resembles the state of the territory in the 1940s. At that time, outside salmon cannery and mining corporations' control over Alaska lawmakers and policies prevented the institution of a tax system that would help provide financial stability and fund the public services and infrastructure that would make Alaska a place where people wanted to stay and make their home. The territory teetered on the brink of fiscal insolvency. The population remained small and transient. All these decades later, the government that oil ruled prevents enactment of measures that would help provide financial stability and make Alaska a place where businesses want to invest and people want to live. As state revenues decline, a majority of lawmakers refuse to consider changing the oil tax structure or reinstituting the income tax repealed in 1980. Divisiveness over the permanent fund dividend threatens to destroy the fund itself. Savings accounts are on the edge of empty. The university system is struggling to stay afloat, the ferry system is sinking, and school systems are in a constant battle to find and retain teachers and fix dilapidated buildings. More people are leaving than moving to the state. The situation is dire but not hopeless. As with statehood, Alaska stands at the precipice of change with the potential to regain control of its political affairs to the benefit of the state and its people.
That is what the book is about.
Good call. I worked for Governor Walker for a year, his first year. And that was where the book started, was that year. I wrote a paper for him on how the state got to a place with oil and gas tax credits that the state was paying more for credits and then making in revenue. And the question was, well, how did that happen? And so I did this history. That was so interesting that once I stopped working, I started writing. And that's when I started writing the book.
When you wrote the paper for Governor Walker, what did you think you were going to find? And were there any surprises right away in terms of doing that initial research?
I was surprised by the politics of all of it, by how clear the story was when, the paper itself was just factual, but there were all these stories around it about why someone voted the way they did. And, the first surprise was that the first oil and gas production tax was enacted in 1955, and it was a woman legislator leading the effort. And that piqued my interest right there.
Can you talk about that first?
I do. Well, briefly, so many drafts of the book.
Right. I was saying, I don't recall that part.
Yeah, no, she's just mentioned briefly at the start. And Irene Ryan is who it was. And one of my early drafts had a whole thing about her. I found a memoir, an unpublished memoir by her I did lots of research on her, wrote about her, and then thought it's not really relevant to the story.
Oh, hey, but you know what? It could be relevant today. Tell us about Irene Ryan.
She was the first woman to graduate from the New Mexico School of Mines. She was the first woman to fly solo in Alaska and the first woman geologist in Alaska. She grew up in Texas. Her dad was an oil field worker, so she grew up around that. She was a journalist. She worked for, I can't remember which paper, but she was reporting on the Texas Railroad Commission or something. It was the commission that was putting in place the first laws governing oil development because, Texas was kind of a madhouse to start with. So she had seen the chaos that came from not having regulation. And so when she was a legislator, geologist, she believed oil was coming to Alaska. And so, well, I do tell this story. They wanted to get the property tax in place that would help tax oil when it came. When that failed, the compromise was to do this oil and gas production tax. And she was the chair of resources then and got that into place.
In 1955.
In 1955, before statehood, before there was oil around, but, there hadn't been any commercial discoveries. That didn't happen until 1957.
On the Kenai. And actually, that's the section that I had earmarked. And I'll just explain why these pages are so interesting to me. As someone who got elected to the state legislature in 2022, who hadn't followed state politics, was not really interested, everything for me was fresh and new. Every argument about fiscal cliffs and the Alaska disconnect, all of that was so interesting because I'd never thought about it before. And so, when I hear people talk about we must have stability for oil and gas development, that the worst thing we can do is make changes to oil tax policy, that all the developers will leave, that we'll lose all of our investment. I was hearing that with fresh ears. But in chapter 2 of your book called First Oil, you talk about, I guess his name is Norbert Skinner, who was a Democratic representative from Clear. And he introduced a bill to raise oil and gas production tax from 1% to 8%. And here are what Alaska oil producers, Atlantic Richfield and Pan American Petroleum, they told legislators that Alaska's astronomically high costs for exploring and producing put most oil and gas projects, quote, so close to the economic minus side that an increase in the gross production tax could discourage the oil investors in many projects. The tax commissioners said with Alaska's high cost, oil companies had yet to see a return of even a single dollar on their investments. And they had support at that time from Senator John Butrovich, a Republican from Fairbanks. He said that Skinner's bill is nothing more than a baseball bat. That we talk about having a good business climate in Alaska, but then when we do things like this, it's the opposite. And I was hearing all of the exact same lines, vocabulary, arguments from literally 60 years ago. They were all said this year in the House.
Yes, of course. That is the argument. And that is a valid argument for the oil companies to be making. And they are consistent with it. The problem, as you go through the book to this history, is that the tax systems that have been developed over the years, none of them could stay the same. The state has been constantly trying to give the companies the incentive to invest. So the tax systems become more about incentives than about revenue producing. And as you go through, it gets more and more extreme until the net profits tax. And, you end up with maybe 12 different tax credit programs at one point. And some of them can be piled up on top of each other. To have a stable tax system, you have to have a tax system that is going to provide the revenue the state needs and, yes, not discourage the companies from investing, but how much should it be incentives?
Right. The culminating moment was, I assume, when you were in the Walker administration, when we owed the oil companies $100 million.
Absolutely. And we were getting less in revenue from the oil and gas production tax than we owed.
Yeah.
And that was, that's the progression. That is how far things went when basically policy followed that arguments that the companies were making, that you have to have a tax system that's going to give us incentive to keep investing. That's how far you could go, to a point where the state's paying more than it's taking in.
What I also found interesting, and I'm going to sort of make a little thesis here and you can correct or refine it, but I just want to flash forward. So Butrovich called it the baseball back in 66, but then a year later, he's Senate president. And he really reversed and he supported an increase to the production tax. And I love this quote from him. He said, the oil companies were in Alaska, quote, not because of us, but in spite of us, because Alaska's geology is favorable to the detection and production of petroleum. Whether the state taxed the industry at 2.5% or 8% would make little difference on what they would do in Alaska, end quote. And I felt like that was quite a turnaround for him. And then here comes my thesis. We make major changes to oil and tax policy immediately following disasters. And what happened in 67 was a massive flood in Fairbanks. And there was a lot of money needed for the recovery effort in Fairbanks. And so Governor Wally Hickel, a Republican, was basically like, well, we've got to raise money. We have to raise revenue. We need to pass tax changes. And then I guess, like, to go forward, we also made major changes after the Exxon Valdez disaster. And then we introduced ACES in the Palin administration after the Vico scandal, which in its own way was a man-made disaster. And so really we were able to, I guess, flip public opinion, flip legislators' opinions because of disasters.
That's true. Absolutely. And that's not really a good way to do tax policy. So I think going back to Senator Butrovich's words, they're something Alaskans do tend to forget in all of these discussions, is that the oil is where the oil is. And, what Prudhoe Bay and North Slope offered was reservoirs where they could drill, produce, and, have a steady production. It was always going to decline, fields decline, but it became a known quantity. And I do have to hand it to the corporations finding ways to do drilling in the Arctic. I mean, it's pretty phenomenal. What's happened is pretty phenomenal that the pipeline's still running. But that doesn't change that it's Alaska's oil, and that one of the ways to get benefit from it is through taxation.
You do this cool thing in your book of having, I guess, little boxes that have sort of an interesting story or something that's kind of relevant to the chapter at hand, but doesn't really fit into the meat of the chapter. I guess, first of all, like, how did you decide to do that? And
Right. Well, it was because a lot of those things were chapters on their own, but I had to part things back, and that's how they ended up in boxes.
Who told you had to par it back?
Me.
You did.
Yeah. No, this is all my effort. I didn't have anybody working with me. I self-published this, for better or worse. And, because what would happen is you kind of go down these paths, and it's interesting to me, perhaps, but I felt I would lose my audience. And I did try to only include things that were relevant to this story. So again, I said, I was keeping the legislature as a through line. So things that happened outside of the legislature, they would end up in a box, whether it was the court case or a story that I had to tell about my own experience, whatever. I just decided that I would put those at least in a side note. Things like Anwar, and Anilka and Anska, books have been written about those. So I just wasn't going to go down those paths. They were all very influential. They were all important to Alaska's history. But I wanted to keep this in the capital.
Who were your first readers, or are you allowed to say?
Oh, I gave my husband, yeah, he read all the chapters and he gave good feedback. Oh, I did have my friend Molly McCammon she's been involved with a lot of authors and stuff. She read it and gave me some feedback as well. I did try to get a publisher. I had some nibbles, but one told me I needed to have around 100,000 people following me on Facebook and that I should go out and gather that, and then they might think about it. And
Oh, wow.
first of all, I'm almost 70, and I wasn't going to go try to recreate that sort of following. And it would have become irrelevant by the time I got it published. So I needed to get it out there. That was sort of my feeling. Things were happening fast, and I needed to just get the story out.
Did your husband know all the people in the book, and did he know the story
He
already?
knows a lot. Oh, yeah. I mean, he'd been in Alaska as long as I had been, and he worked for the Permit Fund, involved politically, and just has a good eye for things. He could tell me when things were not relevant. Yeah, anyhow, I got good feedback. I don't know how I could forget this. My mother read it. Yes.
And did she know where is she?
She's passed away, but she was in Colorado. And no, she had no connection to this. She'd met Sam. She'd met Ethan, I think. But no, she, bless her heart, she read the whole thing. And her comment was, it's too many names. She said, I just bleep over the names. It's like, you got it. Something else I want to say about my mom in her review of the book was it made her sad. Well, two things. One, she said it was a story. She was interested in what was happening, what was going to happen, but she kept hoping better things would happen. And it did bother her at the end, but she'd read the first draft. And I think that the second draft does end on a more hopeful note because of choice voting and things like that happen.
Right.
Anyhow, yeah, she was.
Well, what's interesting is that I have a colleague on the floor. She serves on the resources committee. She was reading your book on the floor this year.
Oh, for goodness sakes.
And I remember I said, I haven't read the book yet. I really want to. And she said, well, she's like, it's going to be easier for you because you will know who all these people are.
Oh,
So
that's interesting. Yeah. Oh, that's great.
okay. Speaking of those boxes, on page 36, you talk about it's the summer of 1969, the 20th Alaska Science Conference, and the theme is change in the North, petroleum, environment, and people. This guy, Richard Engler, is that Robert? Engler. Yeah.
E-N-G-L-E-R.
Yeah. Will you just read the third paragraph, or is this speaking on a panel?
Yeah,
Sorry.
speaking on a panel titled Petroleum Politics and Government, Engler brought his message of caution to Alaska. He warned that Alaskans would face an industry with financial resources greater than those available to most states and many nations, and that the oil companies operating in the state would seek to drive state policy for their benefit. Wherever the industry has functioned, Engler said, its concentrated economic power, the most massive of any industry in the world, has been forged into political power over the community law, the tax structure, the public bureaucracies, and the political machinery.
And that's what we've seen. So it was warned in 1969 that oil and gas companies, their massive wealth would enable them to control the politics.
Yes. And that was a defining moment for me. When I started the book, I didn't know if that would be true or not. And I should say another part for me for writing this book was having seen the coup in 1981 and everything that came after. I always heard that, things were different before oil. And I thought it would be worthwhile finding out, is that true? And, it was not utopia. There were plenty of fights, plenty of disagreements. However, there was an undercurrent and even an overcurrent of standing against industry, standing for people, compromising more, having more discussions. People were not so ideological, especially in Alaska, because a lot of those folks lived through territorial days. And there really was a turning point. I mean, that was, when you asked if there were any surprises, that was a big one, was that you can see exactly when things started changing. And it was in 1984 and 1986 when the oil companies began giving their contributions to Republicans, and not just Republicans, but people who supported that industry view that you talked about, where got to stay competitive and we have to have incentives, we being the oil companies, we have to have tax stability. They were getting people elected that supported that as a policy for the state. And it can also be tied to one person, Senator Ed Dankworth, who used his stature to get the people that the oil companies got elected and get them into positions of power.
Right. And he said in the book, you quoted him as saying specifically that he would make the Senate in his image base. He was going to create who should be in the Senate and control the Senate.
And I think an important thing for people to realize is part of the reason that was so successful is because the Senate was just 20 people. And
so he didn't have to really pay for that many elections.
No, Alaska's a cheap date. You don't have to have that many people in the important positions as long as they are in the top.
Right. Well, bouncing back to John Butrovich, when he shifted his policies, he said it was because he was reflecting on his time as a territorial senator. And he was a territorial senator from 1945 to 1958. And he saw firsthand the effectiveness of the salmon cannery and mining lobbies in preventing taxation, period.
Right. Yes, I know. You have to realize when I'm writing or researching this, it was as new to me as any reader. You're just like, wow.
Right.
Cool.
Yeah, it's very cool. And then flash forwarding to another Senate president, Jan Fakes. She's definitely a villain in the book because she is just relentless in saying that she will not support any taxes whatsoever on oil and gas, period.
She said, and I think this is important, not until government was cut. And people use that term government as though it was some weird box over sitting on the side and we got to cut it. It's really public services. It's really education. It's really our airports and hospitals and roads. So yeah. Now, I don't know that I got this into the book. Later on, she did have regrets and felt like she had been manipulated. But it doesn't change what she did. Yeah.
So speaking of money and influence, you talked about the ballot initiatives that failed, and there's so many. And I think, again, it's good for me to see them all sort of lined up together. But, the Coastal Zone Management ballot initiative in 2012, the repeal of SB 21 in 2014, Stand for Salmon in 2018. It's like all of these ballot initiatives that would potentially take away marginal profit from oil industry. They poured millions and millions of dollars into defeating those ballot initiatives, and they won every single time. I think that's me sort of like feeling like your mom's sadness is that like you want David to defeat Goliath every once in a while. But in the case of these ballot initiatives, Goliath always won.
He did. Yes. And I remember somebody talked to me about a tax initiative, which did end up being put out onto the ballot and losing. And what I said was, you're going to lose, and that will become a mandate. The people have spoken. They don't want a coastal program. They don't want to repeal SB 21. And so you actually end up worse off.
Right.
And I think that the more effective use of money and effort is getting people like you elected.
And that's where it comes down to. So you sort of end on a positive note in the book by talking about Alaska doing things differently, open primaries and ranked choice voting. But,
There's where David won.
yes, but if you go back 2 years ago, when there was an effort to repeal ranked choice voting, we defeated that initiative, but we outspent the other side by an enormous margin. So again, if you just look at the money, Goliath won, which was to keep ranked choice voting. We have it happening again. So that was 2024. In 2026, it's back on the ballot. The folks who want to repeal it are more organized and more legitimate than they were before.
Okay.
You will see that there are some wealthy donors. Jeff Hildebrand, the owner of Hillcorp, has donated. So I think that is an admission in a way that it's bad for industry for moderate Republicans to get elected, and that you need hardcore, I guess, old school Jan fakes like people who are just entrenched, unmovable. We will not change the tax scheme.
Yes, definitely. It has benefited them in the past, and it can benefit them again in the future. I mean, the oil industry is changing in Alaska, but, Hillcorp, sort of the big, they're not as big as Exxon and ConocoPhillips, but in terms of their investments in Alaska, they are the biggest. And so I wouldn't be surprised if they had contributed. I think, too, it's important, again, I'm going to emphasize this because it's not just about supporting the industry in terms of what they would like to see in terms of taxation and regulation. The people who embody that philosophy are also what I will call anti-government. And that is what has hurt Alaska just as much. So you've ended up with taking down the revenue side, keeping revenues low from oil. So you don't have as much funds to spend, and that's coming out of the public sector side.
Speaking of the public sector side, I really, really loved this conference on the future of Alaska convened by the Legislative Council in November 1969. They recommended using oil revenue for government programs such as free public education from early childhood through the first 2 years of college.
Yes.
Revenue sharing with communities to reduce local tax burdens. We did that for a while. We're doing it much less now. Universal health insurance. In 1969,
I know.
We should be going for universal health insurance.
So these were people from all over the state, political backgrounds, and that was what came out of that conference. I know. I find that just phenomenal.
They wanted a guaranteed minimum standard of living, and they wanted protection of the environment against all forms of pollution. They were basically saying, like, hey, if we're going to have tons and tons of oil and gas projects in Alaska, we don't want Alaska to not look like Alaska. Which I assume led to the formation of DEC in 1972.
No, that's a direct connection.
The Department of Environmental Conservation by Governor Egan in 72. Yeah. Okay, so bouncing back to page 148 of your book, I'm going to read just one little paragraph here. You said, prior to 2013, oil company representatives were the ones making the case for lower oil taxes before the legislature. In 2013, oil company employees wielding the gavel in legislative committees and high-level administrative officials made their case for them. And I just think that's so important. And and you did a really good job in the book of talking about conflicts of interest and how we don't really have any sort of conflicts of interest ever being observed in the legislature. It doesn't matter if you are an employee of ConocoPhillips. If you say, hey, I have a conflict of interest, I work for ConocoPhillips, someone objects and you vote on, giving ConocoPhillips more profits.
Yes. Well put.
It is insane. I mean, it really is. It really is. And in this case, we're speaking specifically about Kevin Meyer and Peter Machicki, who were employees of ConocoPhillips and were chairing committees that were looking at tax policy that directly affected their employer.
Yes, their employers testified in front of them. I mean, it does get into a dicey thing of, okay, but these employees were elected. People knew that they were employees. And so It's not clear cut, but it is really disturbing.
Well, and I want to bounce back to the early 2000s, late 90s, I guess, when Bill Allen, who was the head of VECO, which is the service organization that provides services to folks working on the pipeline, that when he was able to make his most powerful, what we know are bribes,
Mhm.
when he had so much power, legislators were making 24,000, 26,000, I think, a year. I mean, like it was a low salary to
Yeah.
be a legislator.
Yeah.
And I think today we make 85,000 a year. And I mean, I do a job outside the legislature, but there are definitely folks who don't have another job, because I think people love to talk about it. Like, well, it's a citizen legislature. You only meet 4 months out of the year. It is
true.
very hard to find an employer that can let you be absent from January to May.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's no longer just a 4-month job.
I'm curious, having worked for the legislature from the 80s through the teens, was there a time when it was less work? I mean, I feel like when you started, they were doing sessions until June and July. The sessions went on forever.
They did. They went on forever. It was great for me because then I had more work. But no, I think it was tough for everybody. And the salaries were ridiculously low for the legislators. Staff actually earned more. And, it's sort of devalues the position. And that was something else in writing this book, is people forget that when you elect somebody, they're making the rules. They're going to make the laws. You are making laws that will affect everybody. And you should be paid enough so that you don't need Bill Allen handing you $100 bills.
100%. You know what I want to end with is your former boss.
Which one?
Ethan Berkowitz, page 136. And then I want to talk about this story really fast because we didn't really talk about the gas line. I'll just say for my colleagues, this book has a whole chapter on gas lines that really does tell the whole story, which I needed to hear. Honestly, if I could go back in time, Lisa, and I could read this book during session, I would have given so much more informed speeches on the floor. I would have done a much better job for my constituents at discussing the gas line in an informed way than I did. So very grateful for your work. But speaking of gas lines, on the floor of the House, this would have been
2006.
This would have been 2006. Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. So this was when they were voting, and every at ease, there was a mad dash to the back of the House so that folks could confer.
We went out in the hall.
Out in the hall, industry executives could make, apparently, based on what he's about to say, they're making phone calls from the floor. Everything is all about the administration. At the time, that was the Murkowski administration, and what oil and gas wanted.
And I saw it. I saw Kevin Jardel leading over the floor. I saw Bill Allen in the front row. Well, he sat in front of me in the gallery. I saw Republican senators in the hall with the oil companies talking to House members.
And they were telling people how to vote.
Yes.
Yeah. So Reed, was he your boss at the time? Were you working for Berkowitz in 2006?
Yes, it was.
Okay. So I guess, will you quote your boss?
Yes, I do. And this is a shortened version of his speech.
Okay.
Okay, so I'll start at the beginning. Mr. Speaker, you got a telephone call. I walked out into the hallway surrounded by dozens of lobbyists, all screaming about the great injustice we've done to them. But this is our floor. Our floor. No telephone call is supposed to change what we're doing. No lobbyist is supposed to peer over the railing and tell us to change our mind. Never should happen. Our obligation is to the people of the state of Alaska. Our obligation is constitutional and is to get the maximum benefit from our oil and our gas. That's what we swore an oath to do. We did not swear an oath to increase profitability for companies headquartered in Houston and London and elsewhere around the globe. So others may want to compromise. I say enough.
Yeah, it's so good. And the reason why I bring that up is because this year, when we were debating, it was the final Monday of session. It was a crazy, crazy day. We had a bill to authorize property tax relief for Glenfarne so that they could build a gas line from the North
I know
Slope.
about this. Yeah.
Yes. But we had a bill in front of us. There was like an amendment that was a completely new bill. So we had like Amendment 2, which was a completely new bill. And then we had like 36 amendments to the amendment. It was just insane. But every at ease, Governor Dunleavy's people in the back, AGDC in the back, Glenfarne in the back, lots of people going back to talk to them, lots of checking in. And I think, and people not even really being embarrassed about it, being like, well, I think Glenfarne's okay with this amendment. And it's just so crazy that feels normal, that like, well, I think if they're okay with the amendment, then we can vote for it. If they're not, then we have to vote no. It was just such a bizarre thing. And I went and purposely got coffee on that side of the room. And, I will never forget it. Someone from the administration said to me, Representative Gray, this amendment kills the project.
Goodness.
Like, just speaking to me.
Over the balcony.
Over the balcony. I mean, like, she didn't lean over.
Yeah.
She was seating back, but she just said, this one kills it. This one kills it.
Wow.
And I just kind of shrugged. But when I read this section of the book, and it seems so outlandish, it's not outlandish. It is still happening. You can watch House Resources Committee meetings where they are literally doing at eases to confer with the company, to see what the company thinks about what's happening, because nothing will happen without the say of the company. And I think the argument that they would make is like, well, if the company can't go forward, then we don't have a project. And so why are we even here? And what I would say from reading your book is that's what oil and gas has been saying since the moment they arrived, that if we don't bow to every request they have, then they can't stay here. It's a bluff.
Yeah, it is. Because again, where's the resource? It's here. I do have to say this about the gas line, though. I mean, after going through this whole history, my conclusion is that the thing for the state to do is to stop trying, stop thinking that the state can make an uneconomic project viable. And this came out of an idea from a consultant in like 1996, like, give this a try. Maybe the state can give enough incentive. Well, we've been through it over and over and given in 2006 everything they asked for. And even that was only getting the producers to consider building a pipeline. If it was economic, if it was a good idea, it would have already happened. And I'm working on a paper right now for the Alaska Historical Society, so I've looked into some of this more. The state's already contributed $1 billion to the gas project through the TransCanada project and then through the Alaska LNG. That's a lot of money. That's money that usually a company like Glenfarne or the producers would be putting up. The state's already paid, and it's still not happening.
Having read your book, just putting me back in the moment of being in my seat in the House, and basically, if you have like the average person at home who's not really following the news very closely and hasn't read your book and doesn't know the history, and all they know is that they're being told over and over again that we're not going to have any more natural gas coming out of Cook Inlet very soon, that the price to heat your home is going to go up astronomically. What are you, the legislature, doing about it? In a very crass way, I voted yes a whole bunch of times over and over again because I was like, I don't want to be seen as being the impediment.
No, then those are the calculus that you have to make. And it does remind me, I mean, it is a serious problem, energy, not just for the railroad, but for the whole state. And think of all the, put all the resources towards small local projects, energy
Right.
projects that make sense in the rural areas, that make sense on the rail belt. All of this effort and so much money going towards the gas line that, like I say, it would have been built already. So it'd be great if everyone sort of stepped back and concentrated on getting better energy solutions for
Hey.
everybody. Yes.
I may get in trouble for saying this, but Kyle Johansson told me towards the end of session, he said, Andrew, next year when you come back and there's a new governor, it'll be like this never happened. He's like, things are going to go on. No one's going to talk about the gas line. We're going to do everything else. It's going to be like this whole nightmare didn't happen. And, and then it'll come up again in a few more years. We'll return and do it all again.
He is not wrong. That, in fact, I will give you this one little story. I remember my first years working, subsistence was a huge issue. We had file cabinets, everybody's subsistence. By the time I was done, it was down to one folder. That's what happens. And it doesn't make things any less important in the moment. But yeah, things do move on.
Well, Lisa Weissler, thank you so much for doing this today. You live in Washington now, right?
I'm in Bellingham. Yes, regretfully, just aging made it time to go. And so, yes, we moved to Bellingham 2 years ago. We're just down the channel, though. I can see the ferry when it docks.
Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@akinlike.gov or call 907-269-0123.